Thank you for joining Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer webinar. Today's webinar is on financial and insurance issues with advocate and attorney Martin Baba. I'm Brittany Starks, Communications Coordinator for Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer, and I will be moderating today's webinar. We would like to thank our sponsors, Genentech, Lilly Oncology, Merck, and Taiho Oncology for providing funding to make this webinar possible. You will be able to ask questions during this presentation. You can type your question into the question section as it appears on the side webinar menu. We will address questions at the conclusion of the presentation as time allows. In addition, the recording of this webinar will be accessible on our website in the lecture library. First, I will share information about stomach cancer and Debbie's Dream Foundation Curing Stomach Cancer. Then, we will hear a presentation on financial and insurance issues with Martin Baba. The presentation will be followed by a question and answer session. In 2018, it was estimated that more than 26,000 Americans would be diagnosed with stomach cancer, and more than 11,000 would die. Most patients are diagnosed at stage 4 when the 5-year survival rate is only 5%, and the incidence rates in younger populations has increased. Yet many know very little about this deadly disease, and little research is being done. Pictured here is the founder of Debbie's Dream Foundation. Debbie was diagnosed with stage 4 stomach cancer in April 2008. She had no risk factors for stomach cancer, and her symptoms were very vague. At the time, she was told that her chance of being alive in 5 years was only 4%. She endured harsh chemo regimens and targeted treatments and experienced many reoccurrences over 9.5 years. Unfortunately, Debbie passed away on December 23, 2017, at the age of 50. She dedicated herself to helping others with stomach cancer by raising awareness and providing resources and education. Debbie founded DDF in April of 2009. As an organization, we are a member of several advocacy coalitions, including the Deadliest Cancer Coalition, the Patient Equal Access Coalition, the State Patient Equal Access Coalition, and One Voice Against Cancer. Debbie served for many years as a patient advocate on numerous committees and task forces. As an organization, DDF will continue her important work and legacy. Debbie's Dream Foundation is dedicated to advancing funding for stomach cancer research, raising awareness about stomach cancer, and providing education and support internationally to patients, families, and caregivers. Our ultimate goal is to make the cure for stomach cancer a reality. You can learn more by visiting our website at www.debbiesdream.org. In a few short years, DDF has achieved many great milestones. We have 29 chapters across the U.S., as well as chapters in Canada and Germany, and events are ongoing around the country. Our patient resource education program helps patients, their families, and caregivers around the world by matching them with survivors and caregivers using disease-specific criteria, including stage, biomarker, and location. We host educational webinars and symposia year-round, and our website contains in-depth information about stomach cancer that can be translated into more than 60 languages. We also have provided $1 million in research grants to date and advocate each year during our Stomach Cancer Capitol Hill Advocacy Day to add stomach cancer to the Department of Defense's peer-reviewed cancer research program. We will be returning to Washington, D.C. next February to maintain funding for researchers. These efforts have resulted in nearly $18 million being awarded to stomach cancer researchers over 3 fiscal years. Please consider joining us February 2020 in Washington. More information can be found on our website under the heading Take Action. This is a current snapshot of our website's homepage with links to numerous resources. Here, you can see some of the many events we have on the horizon, such as our webinar Clinical Trials Update on September 6, 2019, our Dream Big Oceanside Jazz Bruncheon in Fort Lauderdale, Florida on October 27, 2019, and our 5th annual New York Night of Laughter in New York, October 6, 2019. For more information about these and other events, please go to our website and click on Events. DDF is headquartered in Plantation, Florida. Our office hours are Monday through Friday, 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Also on this slide are important phone numbers and email addresses you can use to contact our office and staff. We will now begin the presentation on financial and insurance issues presented by Martin Baba. Martin Baba Esquire is an 8-year stomach cancer survivor and DDF advocate. Martin has been practicing law in the state of Ohio for over 27 years. He has attended DDF's Advocacy Day for the past 5 years in hopes to further progress breakthroughs and treatment options for patients who have been afflicted by stomach cancer and their loved ones. As an adult, Martin has had somewhat of an unusual medical history in that he has experienced 2 different primary cancers. Initially, he was diagnosed and treated for a rare form of non-Hodgkin lymphoma in 2006, and then diagnosed and treated with stage 3B diffuse gastric endocarcinoma in 2011. As a lymphoma patient, Martin had a wealth of resources and options available to him: clinical trials, cutting-edge standard treatment, a vast array of patient resources, and camaraderie, and an overall sense that his stage 4 lymphoma diagnosis was treatable. As a gastric cancer patient, he saw that there was a stark difference in terms of patient resources, treatment options, and positive outcomes. Martin is often approached by other cancer patients and survivors and is asked for legal assistance. We thank him for joining us today. And now, Martin, I will turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you, Brittany. It's a pleasure to be here today. I want to thank DDF for providing me with the opportunity to speak over the last several weeks about some of the critical legal and financial challenges that confront stomach cancer patients, survivors, and their families. In my prior presentations, I've covered several planning strategies that patients and caregivers need to consider from a legal perspective. Today, I'm going to talk about the financial challenges that many stomach cancer patients face, as well as several important health insurance issues that they need to consider. Next slide, please. One of the first things that comes to mind for someone who is newly diagnosed with stomach cancer are the side effects of treatment. Patients are going to ask, how will I tolerate treatment? Patients think about nausea, fatigue, and pain as just one of the many possible physical and medical side effects that come from treatment. Patients and their caregivers meet with their medical team, they discuss treatment options, and they move forward with a treatment plan. These discussions usually involve a detailed and clear strategy about various treatment modalities: chemotherapy, immunotherapy, surgery, and/or radiation. It's not so common, however, to talk about what may be the proverbial white elephant in the oncologist's office. How much is this all going to cost, and how will I pay for it? Next slide, please. Patients, caregivers, and their medical team need to recognize that there may be a financial side effect to having cancer. Fortunately, the healthcare community is now openly discussing the concept of what we call financial toxicity. In a nutshell, financial toxicity refers to the financial and the economic distress and burden that cancer patients experience as a result of the extremely high costs associated with cancer care. Next slide, please. A number of studies demonstrate that individuals with cancer are at a higher risk of experiencing financial difficulty than are individuals without cancer. That may be obvious. There are several medical reasons that create these unique financial challenges. With stomach cancer, we know the following. First, that there are different and multiple treatment modalities. Secondly, that there's the continuing and ongoing need, both as a patient and as a survivor, to undergo various diagnostic procedures. These can include CT scans, endoscopy procedures, genetic profiling, PET scans. All this results in higher costs that are borne through insurance. One of the things that has taken place is that insurers in the United States are shifting more direct medical care costs to patients through higher premiums, higher deductibles, more co-insurance, and more co-payments. One of the additional things that faces or confronts challenges to stomach cancer patients are higher prescription drug costs. In particular, it's very common that stomach cancer patients are provided or are prescribed oral chemotherapy agents, such as Xeloda. Patients need to be very careful about their patient pharmacy benefits specialty tier. Next slide, please. When compared with individuals without a cancer history, cancer survivors have a higher out-of-pocket costs. Many cases, it's also going to happen after the initial diagnosis. There's an ongoing cancer care requirement for both late treatments and follow-up. In addition, cancer survivors are more likely to report being unable to work because of their health, including more missed work days or additional days spent in bed because of poor health. Limited ability to work may also reduce employment-based health insurance options and resources to pay for medical care, further magnifying the financial impact of cancer. Next slide, please. Combined, these factors contribute to the phenomenon of adverse financial effects of cancer treatment, or what we refer to as financial toxicity. There are several possible side effects of financial toxicity. There could be reduced adherence to planned therapy, non-compliance with drugs, delayed or skipped follow-up treatments or procedures, and overall diminished quality of life, and that all may result in greater financial stress, anxiety, and ultimately poorer survival. Next slide, please. While there has been a recognition of the financial burdens of cancer care, public policy solutions to help ease the burdens have been somewhat limited. One of the things that I want to relate to everyone this afternoon is that there are no magic bullets to the problem of skyrocketing healthcare costs. Some of the things that I've listed here on the slide here are really not terribly effective in terms of dealing with stomach cancer situations. Price transparency initiatives are of very little use based upon my experience. Calling a hospital or physician's office and asking how much a procedure is going to cost is next to impossible. One of the frustrating things about medical billing is that we don't get a bill from like a restaurant or any other goods or services. Instead, we get a bill from a hospital, we get a bill from a physician, we get bills from labs, and we get bills from radiologists. So the notion of having price transparency and knowing what things are going to cost is a formidable or an impossible challenge. The next thing that public policy initiatives have included are value-based pricing. Well, here is something where most stomach cancer patients are going to go through either standard therapy or a clinical trial, and there's no real consideration to taking options to, say, high-value patient therapies. Lastly, federal law through the Affordable Care Act, or what's called Obamacare, does provide some safeguards for cancer patients. These include safeguards for pre-existing conditions, lifetime maximum caps, protections for younger adults, but they fail to address the dynamic of higher treatment costs and shifting costs to the patient. Next slide, please. Health insurance helps pay for costly medical treatment and can protect patients and their families from financial hardship. Next slide, please. Patients and survivors must know their coverage. We need to educate ourselves not only about specific medical treatments and procedures, but we need to know just what medical treatment and services are covered by our insurance, how to protect those benefits, how to maintain those benefits, what resources are available to deal with any gaps in insurance coverage, and what out-of-pocket expenses there will be. There are numerous sources of health insurance, but the most common are listed on the slide here. Private health insurance is typically employer-based, that it's made available through people's workplace. There's also public health insurance coverage that takes the form of either Medicaid and Medicare. And lastly, for persons in the military and the armed services, there are health insurance coverages through TRICARE. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Knowing your coverage, could we go back one, please? Knowing your coverage means understanding the terminology and how those definitions work. So I'm going to talk about just a few terminologies or definitions that we encounter in health insurance, but it's extremely critical that patients and their caregivers are literate in the language of health insurance. The first thing that comes to mind are out-of-pocket maximums. So out-of-pocket maximums are a fixed amount that each patient must incur per calendar year in deductibles and co-insurance before the health insurance plan begins to pay 100% of covered expenses. The next thing that's important are distinctions between in-network and out-of-network providers. An in-network provider is a health insurance, is where your health insurance plan has negotiated a contracted rate with certain health care providers. What does a contracted rate mean? It means that it's significantly lower than, say, an out-of-network provider. On the contrary, an out-of-network provider is a healthcare provider where your insurance plan does not have a contract. Next slide, please. So one of the most common problems with health insurance issues is going to out-of-network physicians. The first mistake that people can make is that they go to a hospital's website, find their oncologist, and see that the oncologist supposedly takes the insurance that they have under their coverage. One of the frustrating things is that when we have coverages from places like Aetna or some Blue Cross Blue Shield, there are different plans and different options available to employees regarding their coverage. So the mistake that people can make is that sometimes the insurer and the medical provider that you're seeking to see is included in some network and it's not included in other networks. The solution really is to make sure that your plan's network includes your preferred doctor. What I like to do is to cross-check. So what I do is I call up the physician or the hospital and ask whether or not they accept my insurance. Once I've made that determination, I'll then make the reverse phone call to my insurance company, let my insurance company know who my intended doctor is or what health care facility I'm trying to seek, and make sure that it's covered under my insurance. So it's important to check both sides of the equation and make sure that you're going to get coverage. Next slide, please. So one of the most common things, or one of the more common things, is that stomach cancer patients oftentimes go out of network to seek second or third opinions. One of the challenges then is, what do we do if the physician or the specialist that we want to see is out of network? The first thing that we can do is contact the health provider directly before scheduling an appointment to understand what costs and fees are associated with being seen as an out-of-network patient. In some instances, another cancer treatment facility may be willing to offer the patient a cash price, given the fact that they're an out-of-network patient. In other situations, they may be willing to set up structured payment plans for out-of-network services. So in situations where patients and their families have kind of run up against a roadblock, or there's a need to seek a second or a third opinion, there's a cost-effective way to get that opinion, and then to perhaps allow that new oncologist or the new expert to act as, say, a quarterback or a coach who then can direct services and treatments and therapeutic interventions to a patient's in-network facility. Next slide, please. The next problem that people can encounter are that medications are not covered under our health insurance plans. So here it's important that when we sign up for health insurance or renew coverage, we check the plan's formulary to make sure that it's going to cover medications or treatments that we're going to be using on an ongoing basis. Next slide, please. Patients need to take advantage of the preventative care provisions under the Affordable Care Act. Federal law requires that preventative care be paid for at 100% by insurance, health insurance. So in order to avoid unnecessary out-of-pocket costs, what patients need to do are to ask for tests or ask which tests and how they will be coded, so that if possible, affordable care preventative codes are used so that no charge will be passed along to the patients, and patients understand what treatments or what preventative measures or scans or whatever are going to be covered versus what are going to be out of pocket. Next slide, please. The next slide shows two different possible health insurance problems. The first would be the problem of low premium, high deductible plans. So low premiums mean low monthly costs for health insurance. The problem is that everyone knows that low premiums go with high deductibles, and high deductibles can be financially crippling given the cost of ongoing treatment and surveillance. The next thing that people need to be mindful of are changes in open enrollment. One of the most dangerous traps that people can fall into is automatically renewing their health insurance based upon their last year's coverage. So this can be something that takes place in employer-sponsored plans, or this can take place if we're buying our health insurance on the marketplace through healthcare.gov. Every year during the open enrollment period, patients and their caregivers need to review networks, who's included in networks, who's not included in networks because obviously, like our relationships with our oncologists and our cancer center treatment facilities are critical. These things change. Employers oftentimes change available coverages. Coverages or networks change every year, and this is something that every year patients need to set aside time to review these things. Next slide, please. So the next thing we're going to talk about are insurance claims. A patient files a claim, the health care or the health insurer decides that they're going to deny the claim, and you're stuck. Next slide, please. So there's a process whereby appeals can be filed, and we can internally and externally appeal denied claims. Your insurer must notify you in writing and explain why a claim has been denied. Different time frames apply depending upon the nature of the treatment. If you're seeking a prior authorization for a procedure or a treatment, the time frame is approximately 15 days. If it's for medical services that have already been rendered, the appeal process is a little bit longer. It's 30 days. In the case of urgent care, that process is whittled down to 72 hours. So the critical starting point with appealing a denied claim is to do, number one, understand why the claim was denied, obtain a denial letter, and eliminate simple mistakes. So make sure that the claim wasn't denied just because of, say, like a simple coding error. Next slide, please. Filing an internal appeal essentially means submitting any additional information that you want the insurer to consider, such as a letter from a doctor, your oncologist, or your surgeon. Gathering evidence is critical. The pitch or the case that you need to build is making sure that the services and the treatments that you seek are medically necessary. Next slide, please. Consider engaging outside assistance to troubleshoot the problem. There are numerous resources available to patients to help advocate for appealing denied claims. The Consumer Assistant Program in your state may file an appeal for you. There are other resources, both paid and complimentary, that provide case management. One of the things that a case manager can provide would be more of a neutral and a skilled approach to appealing the denied claim. One of the things that I think is terribly important is that if we're appealing denied claims with insurance companies, it's important not to shoot the messenger. In other words, we don't need to be getting into disputes that take a personal tone when we talk about denied appeals. One of the most dangerous things I think you can do is to get into a fight or make statements to someone on the other end where you're telling them that they're not an oncologist or they don't understand stomach cancer. Those are not helpful. What's helpful is understanding the process and setting forth the appropriate documentation that's going to carry your case forward. Next slide, please. Sometimes internal appeals fail. The next alternative is to seek an external review. So an external review applies in the following situations. It can apply in a denial that involves medical judgment where either you or your provider may disagree with the insurance plan. It can involve a determination that a treatment is experimental or investigational, or it could be based upon cancellation of coverage based upon your insurance claim that you gave false or incomplete information when you applied for coverage. Next slide, please. So the last part of my discussion is going to address what to do about medical debt. Next slide, please. Medical debt can be crushing. The first line of defense is to speak with your healthcare provider. Typically, that means the hospital's patient financial assistance program. There are also other resources that patients can assist. I've listed two of them on my slide here. In terms of patient financial assistance, generally speaking, most hospitals have in place an office and programs that allow patients' medical bills to be either waived or placed on affordable repayment programs based upon household income. The most critical portion is that a patient needs to be organized and to be prepared with submitting the correct and accurate financial documentation to qualify for patient financial assistance. Next slide, please. The second line of defense is figuring out how to create a feasible plan to address those debts. Knowing the unique characteristics of healthcare creditors can be an invaluable tool. So in my experience with dealing with creditors, I can tell you that healthcare or medical providers tend to be the least aggressive and the most amenable to repayment plans. In many instances, medical creditors will agree to accept income-based repayment plans. Healthcare providers are also less likely to report delinquent or bad accounts to credit reporting agencies. In some instances, healthcare providers will simply continue sending bills or statements to patients, but they will not report delinquent accounts to the credit reporting agencies, which can create problems down the road in terms of a patient's ability to access credit for things like a house or a car. Lastly, I think what I've learned is that healthcare providers are more conscious of their online reputations, and they are extremely reluctant to become aggressive in terms of pursuing delinquent accounts against patients. How does that occur? Well, next slide, please. In many cases with non-medical creditors, you'll see creditors like mortgage holders, car lenders, credit card issuers. They'll sue consumers. I have rarely seen hospitals or physicians file lawsuits against patients. One of the things that anyone with any patient or survivor needs to consider in terms of medical bills and the ability to pay them is how medical bills fit into their other debt payments. So there are several other types of payments that people need to make. It's important for patients and their families to kind of prioritize what needs to get paid first and what maybe needs to become secondary. I think the first thing that's most important are obvious things like the need for housing and food. So in that sense, mortgage payments and things like car loans that are needed to get to work or to get appointments need to stay current. The other thing that needs to be maintained or kept current are things like child support and alimony orders. These are things that are not going to go away. There are no forgiveness rules in place or laws for people that have cancer. If a patient has an existing child support or a spousal support order, one of the things they may need to do is consider going back to court and getting those orders modified. Many times people have student loan debts. Student loan debts, unlike, say, mortgage payments and car loans, are more susceptible or more amenable to income-driven repayment programs. So here, these student loan creditors are more willing to listen to hardship situations. Again, it's important that patients provide appropriate and thorough documentation to qualify for either income-driven repayment programs, deferments, or forbearance. Lastly, on the list of priorities of debts, I would include medical debt and things like the department store cards, things like Best Buy, Home Depot, Lowe's, things like that. If push comes to shove, in many cases, I'll tell people perhaps not to pay some of their medical bills as long as it doesn't compromise their access to treatment. Next slide, please. Since healthcare creditors tend to be less aggressive, there is a need to prioritize what bills to pay. There's an old saying, you can only spend $1 twice. So I know that in terms of like our relationships with our healthcare providers, our relationships with our oncologists and our medical team, there is a wish or desire to, pay our medical bills. I have yet to meet a patient who willingly and wantonly does not want to pay for their medical bill. But by the same token, if we only have $1 to spend and we've got $4 or $5 worth of bills to pay, the question is, who do we pay? And so this list here, I think, in terms of who I would pay, mortgage creditors would be first, child support creditors second, car loans next, credit card issuers, that's something that's a little bit tricky. Credit card issues are extremely aggressive about pursuing bad debt. So one of the traps that I see people fall into is that they can, they can work out repayment agreements or perhaps forbearance agreements with the medical creditor, but if they fail to exercise those remedies through like a patient financial assistance program, they sometimes use credit cards to pay for medical bills. And one of the things that I think is absolutely true is that credit card issuers are fairly relentless about pursuing bad debt. So in other words, if you use a credit card to pay for a doctor's bill or for a hospital stay, and you don't pay that bill, what's going to eventually ensue are phone calls and then perhaps more aggressive collection activities that can include lawsuits, judgments, wage garnishments, and perhaps even liens placed on property. Next slide, please. In my practice as an attorney, I have people that come to see me regarding the possibility of filing bankruptcy. So in terms of like the different types of bankruptcies that present themselves for consumers, there are two main types. There's what we call liquidation bankruptcy, which is a Chapter 7, and then we have what's called a wage earners bankruptcy, which is called a Chapter 13. In a nutshell, bankruptcy is a way for consumers to stop relentless collection calls, threats of lawsuits, repossession of motor vehicles, foreclosures of homes, and stopping wage garnishments. A Chapter 7 is something that we call a liquidation bankruptcy. In a Chapter 7 case, a debtor typically is not making any repayments back to their creditors, and they get what's called a discharge. A discharge is essentially a legal order that relieves you from the duty or the obligation to repay debts. Chapter 7 is nice because medical debts are easily dischargeable. Chapter 7 allows debtors to discharge things like credit card debt, medical bills, unsecured loans. A Chapter 13 bankruptcy is what we call a reorganization. So in some instances, a debtor may earn too much money. They can pay some of their bills back, but they can't pay all of them. So this allows a debtor in bankruptcy to set up a reorganization that lasts anywhere from 3 to 5 years, where they can pay their creditors what they're capable of paying, not necessarily what the creditor is demanding. Next slide, please. So in some cases, bankruptcy is something that patients and their families need to consider. There are several myths or several things that I think need to be dispelled. The first is that bankruptcy needs to be stigmatized, or it's something that should be associated with shame or embarrassment. Just as people shouldn't be ashamed or feel wrong about having cancer, patients and their families shouldn't feel any kind of sense of shame of having crushing medical debt. The second thing is that quite often I hear from people and they think that bankruptcy automatically means that they're going to lose their home or their automobile. Well, that's simply not the case. Bankruptcy laws allow people to maintain their primary residence, what we call their homestead, and it does allow them to keep some limited amount of value or equity in a motor vehicle. The second thing that I see that people often misunderstand about bankruptcy is that they're forced or they're required to pay 100% of his or her debts. Like I said earlier, with the Chapter 7 case, the debtor is generally not paying back any of their medical bills. The case lasts anywhere from 4 to 5 months from start to finish, and they're generally not going to be repaying back any of their medical debt. In a Chapter 13 case, a debtor is only paying back what he or she is capable of doing. So what we do in those cases is we run a budget, and the debtor is paying his or her creditors a dividend or a percentage, which is based upon what they're capable of doing. So in some instances, a Chapter 13 debtor may only be paying back their creditors, say, 1 or 2%. The next thing that bankruptcy does is it protects, generally speaking, things like home equity, retirement, and pensions. Now, bankruptcy law is a federal law, but each state has its own what we call exemptions that allow a debtor in bankruptcy to protect some of their property. So each state is going to have different approaches to what a debtor can keep, but generally speaking, equity in homes and retirement and pension assets are protected things in bankruptcy. So if we relate that back to how do we pay our medical bills, one of the things that I think people need to avoid doing, in addition to using credit cards to pay for medical bills, are to take home equity loans or to start taking early withdrawals from retirement and pension accounts in order to pay medical bills. So that concludes my presentation for this afternoon. The one takeaway that I want to leave with everyone here is that it's important to communicate. This is something that I've brought up in my earlier seminars. Talk to your family, talk to your healthcare team, talk about insurance and the financial issues that are confronting you. Ask for help. Make sure you find an advocate, whether it's an immediate family member or friend, who can help pay your bills on time, deal with insurance company concerns, and manage other financial matters. Patients and their caregivers have a lot on their plate. Different people are going to have different amounts of time, energy, and resources to kind of address those situations. Your advocate should be someone who's organized and reliable, someone who you can trust. An advocate can help manage your financial health and certainly offer ongoing emotional support. And the one thing I would also note in terms of the differences between financial issues as opposed to, say, like what we talked about earlier in the summer in terms of like healthcare proxies, is that there are numerous people that one can turn to in terms of dealing with these sticky issues with regards to medical bills and health insurance problems. So hospitals have patient financial assistance programs. There are numerous both free and paid for professionals that can help navigate disputes or discrepancies with either hospital bills and or insurance denials. So there's no one set person that that patients and their families can turn to.
Thank you so much for sharing with us today, Martin. We really appreciate having you. We received some questions during your presentation, so I would like to ask a few in our remaining time. Our first question is, does Medicare, I believe they meant, does Medicare provide second and third opinions?
Generally speaking, they should. That's something where I would prefer to perhaps take that question offline, because given the unique circumstances of a patient and their circumstances, there may be certain out-of-pocket costs that may be incurred, and I think it's going to depend upon a person's coverage.
Our next question is, how do I negotiate with creditors?
So negotiating with medical creditors is a little bit perhaps different than dealing with other creditors. Like I said before, medical creditors are more amenable to working out repayment options. Medical creditors are perhaps more willing to write off bad accounts. So in terms of like negotiating with creditors, my first tip or advice is that nothing ventured, nothing gained. So what does that mean? Well, it means that in order to negotiate with the creditors, you're going to have to initiate a discussion. In terms of what that discussion entails, generally speaking, creditors are going to take an approach of nothing or a bird in the hand beats two in the bush. So in other words, if a consumer or someone that is a debtor owes money, creditors, generally speaking, are going to be willing to take lump sum settlements. So the next piece of advice I give is that, generally speaking, in terms of when I negotiate with creditors for clients, I'm going to be starting off my negotiations on the lower end of the spectrum, and it might be 15 or 20% of what an account is, and that would hold true whether it's a medical creditor or perhaps if it's a credit card issuer. So the thing that I would point out is that consumers or patients, if they do want to try to negotiate with creditors, is not to start off too high. And secondly, that they need to realistically have the resources available to make lump sum settlements.
Okay. And the next question is, what is better for patients, a PPO or an HMO?
Well, one of the things I talked about in my earlier discussions was that no one size fits all for every stomach cancer patient. Basically, an HMO versus a PPO, the answer to that question is going to depend upon the circumstances. But in general, a PPO offers certain advantages in that it allows patients to go out of network, which perhaps would allow them to seek second opinions. The cost of that, however, is that PPOs tend to be a little bit more expensive than an HMO. An HMO, on the other hand, is going to have a network that's more limited. The monthly cost or the monthly premium, generally speaking, is lower, but the ability to go out of network and to have coverage out of network in many instances is non-existent. So what that means is that people that are in HMOs, if they do want to go for a second opinion outside of their network, that they're going to be 100% liable or responsible for those costs.
Unfortunately, we are out of time for more questions today. Martin Baba, thank you for joining us and sharing your expertise. This webinar is brought to you by Debbie Stream Foundation, Curing Stomach Cancer. The recorded version of this and past webinars can be found in the lecture library of our website. Thank you again to our sponsors, Genentech, Lilly Oncology, Merck, and Taiho Oncology for providing funding to make this webinar possible. As a reminder, please check out our website and your calendars to join us for an event near you. Thank you all to our listeners. This concludes today's presentation. Please be on the lookout for information about our upcoming webinars this year. To view any of our recorded webinars, please visit our lecture library and search by the topic you're interested in. We would also love to hear your feedback, questions, thoughts. Please be sure to take the survey that will be sent to you once this webinar concludes. For any questions or suggested topics for future webinars, send your comments to programs@debbiestream.org. And for more information, please visit www.debbiestream.org. This concludes today's presentation. Thanks so much for tuning in.